Welcome to How to Theater Resumes and Portfolios. We're going to talk a bunch about how to approach resumes and portfolios, and we've got some examples of things to show, some websites, and other kinds of things to go through. I'm Jayme Mellema, by the way. I'm the scenic designer for University Theater at NC State.
I'm Mike White. I'm the assistant technical director for productions at University Theater.
So this discussion is sort of built on our experience with dealing with resumes and portfolios and things. It's maybe not definitive. I don't claim to necessarily be an expert, although I have been involved in the hiring of pretty much nearly all of the artistic staff at University Theater at this point. So, I've seen a lot of resumes and I've made a bunch myself, some of which we'll get to look at later. So we do have some experience with this, but resumes and portfolios tend to be a little bit on the subjective side. There's a lot of established things that are kind of obvious, but things that I like might not be things that everybody likes about resumes. So inherently, you're going to need to be speaking to your audience a little bit, and ultimately sort of picking and choosing the things that make sense for you, and doing things that are going to best showcase you as the artist.
Resumes are a very personal thing.
Yeah.
It's a short representation of who you are as a person, as an artist.
Yeah, and your history and your work. So we're primarily, because Mike and I are technicians, theater technicians and designers and things, like we're going to be talking mostly from that point of view, but we are going to try and chime in with how actor resumes and some of those kinds of things might be different where we can. But we are, just to let you know, sort of speaking more from a theater technician point of view. We have extra time at the end and you have a portfolio or resume you want us to look at, we can do some share screen action and see what happens and talk about it. But I have no concept of if we'll have time for that or not. So if not, we are considering doing a full resume doctor and portfolio doctor session next semester. So if that's something you're interested in, let us know in the chat. And that would be basically people bringing us their resumes and portfolios, and we can look through them and give you some tips. So without further ado, let's get into this stuff. Where should we start?
Probably best to start with resumes specifically.
Yep.
So resumes on a very basic level should be the representation of what you've done in the last mostly 5 years of your work. It should include brief examples of your work, who you've worked for, what your skills are, and information about yourself. You want to, with theater resumes specifically, you want to keep them to one page, one-sided, yes. But fill using as much information as you can and filling up your whole page.
Yeah, I mean that's a delicate balance to be playing, how full is too full and to the point where it feels cluttered. It ultimately becomes a little bit of a design challenge. So having other people look at it and evaluate it can be really helpful and important. I will say this also is that doing portfolios specifically and resumes, but it can be a lot of work. And a lot of people, particularly students, will put off doing it until the week or a few days before an event where they need a resume or something. I highly recommend not doing that. Do it early, update often, or at the very least, be gathering things as you go in your career. And that career could be your time in college, your time just outside of college. Gather photos as you go. Make a list of every show you've done and every show and every position you've held, and update that with every show that you do. You will thank yourself later, because after now being 20 30 years of doing theater, I cannot remember some of those early things, and I'm so glad I have them at the very least written down that I did it. Otherwise I would forget completely. So start now when you're younger to make that master list, and you can use it for reference throughout the rest of your career.
And the further away from a show you get, the harder it is to find photos.
Well, and they tend to blur together a lot. So especially if you're working with a lot of same people over and over again, like some people like end up at a theater where they do a lot of shows together with the same people, and it becomes hard to pull apart which show happened when. So having that master list is really helpful. Right. I feel like we should have an example up that we can look at as we talk about this, but can you see it okay? Is it presenting okay? All right. So this is my, I don't know, is this baby's first resume? As you can see, I did not follow the first rule of Fight Club, which is one page only. So I had a lot to say, y'all. So
that's basically the biggest thing that I hear from anybody in the business. Everybody will tell you one page, one side. There's even people that I've heard from, if it's anything more, you don't even get looked at.
Yeah, I will say some people have put references on the back, and I think that's fairly acceptable. It's not maybe ideal, but if you really are tight on space, that could work. But also, if you're that tight on space, maybe you need to rethink about how you're organizing it and what you're including. It might be you need to cut a couple things that you don't need. All right. So,
so general layout for your resumes is.
Let's talk about what's.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So starting off at the top of it, you want to do your general information, and so things like your name, what your specialty is. So scenic artist, scenic designer, carpenter, actor, whatever it is, along with contact information, and sometimes address. It's one of those things that address is kind of fading away.
It is, and yet I feel like I'm still seeing it.
Yeah. So I mean,
people are still including it,
dependent.
and it might be entirely out of just tradition at this point. It's hard to say.
So email, phone number, big things, along with making sure that your name is easily visible and very present on your resume without being too.
I don't feel like this is quite present enough for me. Yeah, I think you could. So to answer the question, I think you could just do city and state. Like we're saying, it's less important. I think email addresses and phone numbers and websites are much more important these days. So I would think, like if you're in New York City, like some cities, you might want to be really clear that you're, like, for instance, if I'm applying for a job in Boston, but I live in Michigan, that might be information for the person you're applying for might want to know, like, oh, this is a relocation for that person. Because that might factor into, like, well, we can't afford to help you relocate. So that may be a factor. So including where you are currently in some fashion might be useful,
And that's about what you need for your basic information.
Title bit,
You want to make sure that what you're applying for is prevalent in your resume entirely. So less experienced people will have a lot more of a general resume to be able to have enough experience. But as you gain more, you'll find out that your resume will become more specific and specific to what you're applying for and what your specialties are. Some people have multiple resumes for each field.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend that if you're a younger person and you're just out of college and you might be applying for a variety of different kinds of positions. Say you're really interested in lighting design, but have done a lot of work as an electrician, and you might be looking for an electrician jobs or design jobs. Having a resume that's focused toward being an electrician and having a resume that's focused toward being a designer and have those be different is really helpful. Because here, I'm trying to be too many things. I'm trying to be both these things at once, and where really I could have two separate ones. And in fact, that's what I ended up doing, was doing one that was focused specifically on scenic art, because I was applying for a scenic art job versus a designer one. And I did include design experience, but I think I removed the projects completely from that and pared it down. I'm gonna skip to the next one to see if it improves
See if you change. Oh wow, it's so different.
So different. It's jumping ahead on me here. Sorry. All right, there we go. So yeah, this one is 4 years later.
Single page.
Single page. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So you go.
One thing that is different here is this is much more paragraph oriented or versus list oriented. And either can work just fine. In fact, most of the time I'm more in favor of the list just because it gives you much more information, right? You can be like, if you're listing like scenic art or scenic design experience, say at the top, the position held might not be a necessary column, right? It's kind of obvious because you've already given it that category. So director information can be handy. Where it was produced is really helpful. Sometimes the year matters, but you can also add the year to the show itself. There's a little flexibility in that.
Yeah.
I'm always in favor of the more names that you can throw onto your resume, the better, because it is an extremely small world.
It is.
I think the more chances that someone on your resume could be a connection for you at a job, you're like, ooh, I know that person. Let me call them and ask them about that. That happens all the time. So getting a variety of names on your resume, either as directors or other artists you've worked with, can be really, really helpful.
Mm-hmm. So for it, the things that I recommend a lot for people is definitely making sure when you put down your experience is break it into, especially for younger people, your more professional experience, and then if you need to include your educational experience, do that also. But you'll understand that as more professional experience you get, the less educational you need in it.
Right.
And so you want to break down the main meat of your resume into your info, then your experiences, your education, your skills, then your references and your other categories. So like the awards that you've received or the special trainings, stuff
Typically,
like that.
For me, references are always the last thing. And
I've seen that
some people put education first, and that's okay too. So like your title blockness, then education, then all your experience, and then your special skills, and then the references. It can go either way, and that's totally fine. Yeah, I think if you are further along in your career, education probably could go toward the bottom, whereas if earlier on in your career, it might be more beneficial to have it up top. I don't think there's a benefit or...
There's no really a set order of which ones.
I don't really, it doesn't bother me either way. I don't really think there's a deterrent for putting it up top, so.
Yeah, me either. So going into your experience itself, definitely making sure that you have your position, and for the technician side at least, your position in the show, who you worked with or / the director. Sometimes for positions like carpenters and stuff like that, I definitely like to recommend doing more than just the director, because you don't usually work directly with them, but your supervisor or your technical director, or something like that. So somebody who can speak on, or the designer, somebody who can speak on what you did.
Right.
Along with some people put a rough time of when it happened, so that, it's a relatively new or older thing.
Yeah, if you're a designer, you would put the director. If you are working, if you're in one of the tech fields, you might put, if you're, say, an electrician, you might put the master electrician, or you might put the designer of that show.
Or the production manager, or
the production manager. There's some
like
variety there. Sometimes it's a strategic choice about whose name might be more influential, or whose name might more people know in your field. So you can think about it in that way as well. As you can see here, like, so this is the direct edit. So this one I got some critique on and edit for, and I redid for the second version of it here, which I think is much improved. Bigger name, some pretty border action. For some reason, they did not like my little checkboxes. I think maybe because they were not present enough. So
Maybe.
it's important to sort of designate sections.
Organization.
Organization is huge.
So important.
And being able to tell what's a heading versus what's underneath it. Like, so making sure that your headings are of a bigger size, or that the show titles are like, how you organize that is really important. And we'll look at some other examples too. Move on to the next one. Whew, some more lists.
Yeah, but it looks so much better.
It's does.
So much, the space is filled out a lot better than before. Yeah. You're using a lot more of it. There's less white space.
Yeah.
It's a lot more organized.
The previous one, this was for getting into graduate school. So it was a little less about a job and more about all the experience. And so paragraph form felt like it made more sense because I'm talking about all my experience in that kind of way versus who I've worked for and might make a connection with. Do you know what I mean? So that's catered slightly differently to that experience. Whereas this one is much more about jobs and like, here are names, some more names, please.
Here are all the things I've done.
Yeah.
Who did I do them with? Where did I do them?
Exactly. And then in here, I've included things like awards and honors as well. And under awards and honors, you can include things like not just actual awards. That's why you can do honors in there as well. You can put in things like scholarships. Generally speaking, things like GPA are not really needed.
Unless it's grad
if someone
school.
puts GPA on their theater resume, I tend to think of them as being, it's not a bad thing. I tend to think of them as younger or less experienced because they don't know that we don't need that. Like, we don't care. Like, how well did you do your work? That's what we care about. I don't care as much about your GPA. But I mean, again, that's a personal preference. Other people may disagree with me. But yeah. And you can include projects and things that are not completed yet if you're handing out a resume. Like in here, I had not finished my master's yet, so I had the anticipated completion date in here. And you can do that with projects too. You can be like this one here, right? It says in production, this show is not completed yet. I've done that a couple times over here as well.
Yeah, and a little thing is like, if it's something that will have already happened by the time that you get this job, definitely include it.
Yeah.
Like if it hasn't happened yet, but you're working on it, or it will have happened by then yeah.
Often when you're younger, the challenge is like, how can I pad this out to make it look impressive? And it's really like, don't put in filler. It's really just like, you're including more things that you might not otherwise. Like if you recall on my very first one, I had some student projects in there, like some design projects, things that were never realized, but things that I worked on to kind of say, hey, I've done stuff, even if it's not, even if it's not realized, right?
So to answer the question that's up of how do you put unrelated jobs in it? It's a harder thing to do in the way that they're organized. It definitely fits in skills. And they can also always put sections of other things that you've done. Because other fields, a lot of fields such as like wait staff or retail, all have really good experience in working with customers and working with outside people in resource or managing people.
Right, managing a team,
a lot of great for management experience.
Collaborative environments. Those are all good things. Yeah, so what's not in my resume here is a section on skills. So skills can be like, you could do one that says skills and include some of your older things that you've done, like I waited tables here, I did this there, things that are less related. And then you could use special skills, which would be more of your theater related skills, like I know how to use the CNC router or whatever the special skill might be. Like I know how to juggle if you're an actor, right? Like things that might end up on a special skills list.
And for experience, it doesn't always have to be experience that you're paid for or educational.
Right.
Your volunteer experience is just as valid as
Absolutely.
every other type of experience. So
Right.
it's worth putting in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's definitely, if that's most of your experience, it's still experience. And
Yeah,
you're still learning
absolutely.
how to do the job.
You might want to indicate that it was a volunteer
Mhm.
job somewhere, that it wasn't, that you weren't paid for it, but so it'd be like if one of my scenic design experiences was like, say, Calvin College, I was a volunteer, I might be like, I might include that somewhere in here about
Mhm.
that was the position that I did.
Volunteer carpenter,
Right,
volunteer
right,
painter, stuff like
right.
that.
I think it's extremely relevant.
Mhm.
But I think the information about where you paid or not paid for that is still sort of relevant because it speaks to where your level of experience might be. And so that might be important information. My Q&A box
Information
went
is
away. I
always
didn't
good.
see it.
Yeah, you're good. So I guess moving into skills, since we've covered a lot
Yeah.
of experience. So skills are a really great place to show your range of what you can do. The big thing I've learned with skills is don't put in special skills the things that are expected of you in the position that
Right.
you're trying to apply for, because those aren't really special. They're just kind of expected.
Right. If you're applying to work in a scene shop, you don't need to tell us that you know how to
Yeah.
use a table saw. It's kind of expected that you should know how if you're going to do that.
Mhm.
That might be
But
where you put like
if you're
CNC router, right? Like, oh,
Mhm.
I've used a CNC router. That's information that would pique people's interest.
special tools, or
Right.
if you're applying to be a carpenter, then you know how to run a light board. That's definitely valid to put in there.
If this is a good place to put, like, as a young person, if you've got like, I'm applying for an electrician job, but I've also designed a couple shows. I mean, I would put that in a separate category. But I mean, there might be like, oh, I also did costume design for one thing. It's like this is a place where you can list a lot of those other experiences that speak to your experience, but are not necessarily directly relevant to that position.
Yep. Things that make you more, what is it? That make you stand out and make you more hireable.
Yeah.
As a technician or
shows
as
that
an
you're
actor.
a well-rounded person, even. Like,
and for people who are actors, definitely putting things like accents that you're proficient in, or special trainings, such as like, do you have specific skills and types of theater, or trainings
you've
in
done
things like
workshops or training. Or like
things like Meisner or Shakespeare. Are you specifically trained in those?
Right. The juggling, the accents, all those kinds of things can go there. For
you know how to play piano,
right?
Guitar,
music,
things like that.
There's whole sections also for that for actors. We'll look at a couple examples for that too. What's next on my slideshow? Other resumes. We've talked a little bit about awards and nominations already. Is there anything I missed?
No, that I can think of.
No,
specifically. We can talk about.
We should talk references though.
References, yeah. So the standard reference number is 3. It's the minimum, but also the standard.
I mean, 4 is okay. Anything more than that is too much.
Yeah,
they're not going to call all those people. Less than 3 is to me would indicate that you don't know enough people. Or like there are not enough people who would speak highly of you to talk to. So 2, under 3 is not good. 3 is great. 4 is okay. 5 and above is too many.
It's too many. And so your references, you want them to be people who can speak highly of you and are knowledgeable and have worked directly with you on whatever job it is. So you want it to be the person, where they work and who they work, like where they work and what their position is, and then contact with them. Whether it be, it's usually determined by the person who is your contact, whether it's usually a phone number, sometimes it's an email address.
Right.
Depending on
Back
that
in the day,
person.
it was phone number. Nowadays, it's email
Less
address.
people
Usually
answer their
both.
phones now.
Usually both.
Hmm.
But here's a big one. If you're putting someone on your resume, make sure they know about it. That will not speak well of you if someone calls your reference and they have no idea they're your reference.
Hmm.
Um, you need, ideally, you are getting their permission to be included as a reference. So you should be asking folks if they'll be a reference for you. You should also then, for instance, if you ask someone last year, or so maybe you applied for a job and used them as a reference and that went well and it was fine. And now it's 2 years later and you're looking for a new job. You don't necessarily have to ask their permission again, but what you should do is let them know that you are looking again and they might be getting a call. You want the people who are speaking about you and to speak highly of you, right? You want them to know that this is coming their way, so they're mentally prepared to talk about you.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if it's been some time has passed, that they're going to have to refresh their memory about you, because it might be they're not, you know, they're not your bestie. They've also seen 2 other classes of students since then or whatever. So give folks a heads up. You don't want them being surprised, because that will not help you in that phone call that you have no control over.
And you want your references to be somebody, the most recent of people you've worked with.
Yeah.
So typically people say within the last 5 years. Sometimes that gets harder when you work with people for more than 5 years.
Right.
But it's more, it needs to be the more recent people who can speak on your behalf, because you change and you become better or worse.
You can see that right here on my 2 that I have up. It's like I had one of them swap out for another one, because they're 4 years apart. Yeah, so they're going to change over time. And I like, for me, in this case, I wanted people who were sort of very different. Like as a designer, I wanted someone who was maybe a mentor, and I wanted someone who was a director I have worked with, and then maybe someone, in this case, it was someone who I had paint experience with. Here it's switched to more than one director and a mentor. But you like having some variety if you're, you know, like an instructor, a professional colleague, you know, some variety, like, so they're not all, it's difficult when you're younger to not have all instructors, but if you can do some variety in there so they're not all instructors as a younger person, that's really helpful. It doesn't speak ill of you if that's the case, but that variety is handy and might indicate to an employer like, oh, this person has moved beyond their undergraduate education already, and that's good. That's a good thing.
So I think those are the main sections of the resumes. So
Yeah.
again, just to reiterate, your info, your experiences, your education, your skills, and your awards, and then your references.
Yeah. And then if you're an actor, also headshots.
Yes.
Yeah. So usually they're stapled to your resume. Usually one staple is enough. And make sure it's as professional a headshot as you can get. This is not just your Facebook profile photo, right? Often you have to pay someone to do it, and it's not always cheap. But maybe you have a really amazing photographer friend who will do it for free for you or at a discount. It just depends, but professional headshots. Sometimes non-actors will include photos on their resumes. To me, it just takes up space. Where you can fill it with other things.
Just can be clutter sometimes.
Right. Like I don't know any technician or designer who would include a full headshot. But sometimes they'll put like a picture of them in the corner or something. There's nothing bad about that necessarily. It can be nice, but it can also take up space. So I'm sort of like 6 of 1 about that. So before I go through a few more examples, there's one more note I want to make about quirkiness. So you do want your resume to stand out and feel like it represents you and your uniqueness and what you can bring to a job. Sometimes people will add fun or funny things to their resumes, and that can be good and bad. I think there are things to be said in either direction on that. So I think the important thing is that you know that it does come with pluses and minuses. It's a bit of a gamble that one person might find your funny or cute thing funny or cute, and another person might find it really off-putting. So yeah, that's a gamble. But on the other side of that coin is that can be like it's a litmus test, right? It's almost like a dating profile, and you put horseback riding as a thing. Like if horseback riding is a big thing for you, and this potential partner on your dating profile is not into horses, then they know to move on. And so if someone's not going to get your joke, that could also be maybe that this is not the right job for you anyway. So be careful. I think the most important thing about it is to know that if you're going to do that and you're going to put something cute or funny or whatever onto your resume, that you're doing it very thoughtfully and very intentionally, and not flippantly. For instance, we had before Mike, we had Stephen Frausto. He, on his resume, he said he gave perfect high fives. And to me, that was hilarious and was part of what we thought was an interesting fit. And I mean, he had a lot of great things on his resume, so it wasn't the only reason why we talked to him, but it was a plus in his category. When we were trying to replace him and ultimately ended up hiring Mike, we looked at some folks, and one candidate had, like, in their special skills, dreaming. And to me, that was a little off-putting. And I was like, but that might just mean that that person was not the right fit for us. But another person, like maybe at the Children's Theater of Charlotte, might see dreaming and be like, oh, that's so sincere and sweet and wonderful. And it might be a great fit for that person. So, right.
The representation of who you are.
Right. So just, if you're going to do things like that, just make sure you're doing it very thoughtfully and carefully. Is, I guess, all I'm going to say about that. So here's some professional designers. You can see they're very list oriented, you can see. Because at this point in their career, like, awards are important, education less so. All the places I've worked are more important. And who the people I've worked for are important, right? So this is going to be further along in your career sort of situation. These are other graduate students. So I have removed some information to protect identities, but these are very old. I acquired these when I was just leaving graduate school as well. So,
and as you can see on the one on the left here, that's a lot of references.
It's too many references and no information about how to contact them.
And their organization is really strange in their experimental devised work category.
Right. It's a little bit difficult to read, particularly down here. Up here seems okay. As it moves down, I'm like, what am I looking at here? So it might be that this section just needs to be more paragraph oriented instead of column oriented, and it might clarify that better. And over here, this is organized pretty nicely. I feel like these categories could be more boldly defined, like bigger, and maybe some like breaks in here would be handy. Like, and a space here between skills and references would be handy. Like some spacing between these, so some air is challenging.
Definitely.
Font size, right? Nothing should ever go below 10 ever. 0.10 font. Ideally, it's sitting more like at 11. I mean, 12 might be pushing it, even though it's more of a standard size. But it's
the big thing to play with resumes is borders. Make sure that you're optimizing your borders on it.
Right.
You want to be careful to not go too far out that it can't be printable, but you definitely want to expand past standard word borders.
This feels like a little too close to the edge here to me. These
But the
top and
left
bottom
one
side seems okay, but this just feels wrong. That's such a horrible way of.
But the left one has the borders you could have optimized a lot better for getting more thickness.
I like the graphic of it, but like the fact that the top and bottom border are thin and the sides are wide
really thick
feels again a little disorganized.
It's all about how you lay it out.
I know.
So like for the right one, I'd say move the name next to the rest of their info, and then you can get more space out of it to space out the rest of it.
Yeah.
Even if it's just messing with your paragraph sizes.
I really like the organization of this. Even though I had to black a lot of it out, their name is really big and the spacing seems really good. The information is broken into sections that is really defined.
Very easy to read.
The titling of it is maybe a little bit difficult to read. I might make that a little more bolder, but it's very nice. And everything's got a little bit of air to it, which is nice.
And it very much shows a designer.
Yes.
It's very designer.
It's true. We can usually tell like designers from technicians and things.
With the choice of font and everything, it's a very designer looking resume. Which is good. So
if you're a technician and you're not so sure, ask a designer friend to look your resume over and get some advice about how to jazz it up. So here's some actor examples. Robert Pattinson. So they do tend to include photos on the resume itself, aside from, so you could also just have a separate headshot, but some cases you're not handing in a headshot and a resume, right? Sometimes it's just the one. So in here you've got education and things and instruction. If you've got other kinds of instruction and classes or workshops, they could go under education as well versus special skills. Here they're breaking their credits by film and television, voice, and you could do theater as a separate section as well. Some people also include their representation information, right? So this is going to have, like Robert Pattinson is going to have representation information up at the very top along with his own, right? And so some folks so if you're a performer and you have representation, you may not necessarily be including your personal representation. You might be including your representation information on how to contact you. And in here, you're gonna have actors are gonna have a lot more personal details like height, weight, role types, eye colors, those kinds of things. Age range. So yeah, I would not, as a performer, include your actual age necessarily. I would ask some friends and family or colleagues to say, what age do you think I can play? What ages can I play? Because what your actual age doesn't really matter, right? What matters to casting folks is what kind of range of people, can you play from 10 to 30 or, whatever it is, like that's going to be more important to them than your actual age. And down here, we've got accents, dialects, things like that. And in this case, you might have music and dance, could be its own thing instead of under special skills. Here we've got another one.
He's skilled at darts.
That's really fun. Swimming, bowling, darts, love it. It seems silly, but for a performer like that, where you are potentially working on big budget films that require you to horseback ride, or
less training they have to do.
Yeah, the trainings and the sport type things might be important.
Mm-hmm.
It shows also like your coordination. It's like, oh, I do a lot of dance, or I'm like dance information and music information are really handy on actor performer resumes. This is also broken into television and film and some of your training, right? Instead of education, right? They've got a separate, so this is where they're educated. They got a separate section for training. And then instead of skills, this person is using the term talents, which is really fun way of doing that. I kind of like that. I feel like the organization, I really like how this has borders and lines and division that's better here. Whereas This feels like it's from a website and less clear reading. And
Something that we hadn't talked about,
Mm.
but looking at this now is very interesting. Is you want to make sure with your email, you want to make sure that it is a professional email and not
Yes.
just your quirky named personal email. I mean, if your personal email is a professionally named one, good.
Yeah, it's fine.
Um,
But
where
you
like
don't want to be like googly eye 25
Yeah.
or whatever it is on your professional resume. You might need to either change one of your email addresses to be a little bit more professional, or you might want to set up a separate one for that. That's a good point, Mike.
Where like Yo Teddy is kind of on the border, but it's quirky.
Is that what this one is?
Yeah, it's Yo Teddy. Yo Teddy.
I can buy that one.
Yeah,
it is on the edge, but I'd be like, sure.
Mm-hmm. But you'll see most people will put their name as their email because it's easily identifiable.
Yeah, that'll show up in some of the websites and things. It'll be just like, for instance, one we'll look at Shauna Johansson. I'm Shauna at shaunajohansson.com.
Portfolios are a lot more expanded version of what you've done as a professional or what you've done and in your career as a technician.
Right. It can include education related things in it, of course.
Which also, I still include that technically as your career, is your lifelong of what you do.
Well, you were just saying professional, and I just wanted to be clear that we're not necessarily like, if you are only coming from a point of view of having educational work, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have one or shouldn't do one.
So there are two main types of portfolios. You've got physical paper ones, and then you've got websites.
Yeah, let me look at a couple things here before we get to that. This is a more detailed look at what you've done. Ideally has more examples of things, and for some people that'll be photographs, and for other people that might be paperwork or an organization and charts. It just depends on the discipline that you're working in.
It's still a very big representation of who you are. So if you're a stage manager and it's not organized, it can be a big red flag for a lot of hiring.
Right. And if you're a designer or someone who works visually and it seems disorganized or not visually well put together, that can also speak, right? So again, this is why you should not do these things in the last minute. You should be thinking about them sooner. Portfolios in particular take a lot of time to put together.
Way more than you think.
Way more than you think. So give yourself time, start gathering. The thing that takes the most time is just gathering all the stuff together, having the photos printed and having that, like, think about that sooner rather than later.
Organizing all of it.
As you gain more experience and more stuff, you'll edit things out and whatnot as you go. And everybody's going to organize their portfolio a little bit differently. But everything we've talked about, clarity and easy to read and the organization of resumes, should still also apply to portfolios. The thing that I would say about, neat and organized and easy to follow, the thing I would say, like, a lot of resumes tend to be very chronologically listed and organized. I would say portfolios do not have to be chronological at all. Here's what I love about portfolios, and we'll get into this more about the difference between online versus paper, but they are your opportunity to tell your story. So the way in which you organize and the order in which you put things, right? So which shows go where in your portfolio can tell the story you want it to tell. So just like with any kind of like book or story, you would like want to put something nice and flashy up front and maybe something nice at the end to wow with, maybe another favorite in the middle to carry it along, and then put in mix some things in there in the middle. Like, there's a story you're telling with that, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But I think consistency is also important when it comes to resumes and portfolios. Like, in terms of, to me, it speaks very highly of a person if their resume fonts match the fonts in their portfolio, match the fonts in their business card. It means that they've thought about their whole presence entirely and not just one at a time. You know, people talk about branding, right? This is sort of like branding light. So consistency across your platforms can really speak volumes about your organization, your attention to detail, and that style and that format consistency. It shows that you're thinking things through completely all the way and care about details and things.
And it shows that you're proud of your work.
Right, and you want to show it off to the best of its ability. Photography, some portfolios are really dependent on photography and others are not. Like if you're a sound designer, photography is not as important. Paperwork is, and the organization is. But if photos are important to your portfolio, you should be taking them as much as you can, as often as you can. So as you're doing, especially if you're early career, like a student or just out of school or whatever, be taking process shots of things. So you have photos documenting how things were created, and that you should get some good professional photos of finished work, sets and whatnot. Most places have them done anyway, and you just need to ask for permission to get them a lot of the times. For us here, we put them all up on Flickr. Our students have access to anything that they want. So just gather those things as you go, not like, okay, now I need to go back and get all 4 years worth of my stuff from undergrad, because that is going to be a lot of work. So again, the more you can do as you go, the better.
And with photos, make sure you annotate them. Make sure you give credit to the people who have worked on it, along with, if it's specifically a photographer or something. If it's known, then yes. But very, very much designers, director, the people important in the work.
And that's whether you're on in a website or in a paper version or whatnot. You want to make sure you're giving credit. In some cases, you don't necessarily need to credit every single person. No. It just depends. But again, it's another opportunity for you to introduce names. Like on your resume, you're not going to, like if I'm a scenic designer, my resume is not going to include necessarily the costume designer or the lighting designer, right? But in the portfolio, I can. And so that's another opportunity for people to make connections that might speak highly of you.
And then you also want to, along with photos, you want to include, say, like a brief description of the things that you did, either the things in the show itself or specifically what you did for each of them.
Right.
And like the complications of the show and stuff like that.
Especially if you were like a scenic carpenter or you were costume construction, and you worked on certain pieces, you can have photos of those certain pieces and then some production shots that have that piece in the end. You could do a finished set photo if you're a carpenter and then talk about which of those elements you worked on. So yeah, specificity about that will be important depending on what it is that you're doing and applying for. And again, this is a place like where having flexibility can be, it's more difficult in a paper version to have like, this is my painting portfolio and this is my design portfolio. But I had a paper one, a physical, and I just had one that the pages could come out. And so I would just have different pages and I could reorganize them to tell the story I wanted to tell depending on the job I was applying for.
There are good things and bad things to both paper and digital. With paper, it's very good to take with you and to be able to tell a story throughout while showing somebody on it.
Yes.
But it's harder to edit and adapt it and expand it. And then a digital one, so like a website or something, is good to send and easy to edit. But when you try to take it somewhere for, say, a convention or something, it's not reliable. You cannot rely at SCTC or USITT. You cannot rely on your website loading at a convention center.
Also, a website gives you, especially if you're like at USITT or you are in an interview, like you have zero control over what what your interviewer clicks on, which means you have no control of the story you're trying to tell. So they could click on your very worst show first and you have zero control about, and then now you have to talk about that show. So I'm always in favor of having a physical thing, and a physical thing doesn't necessarily have to be paper. It could be an iPad that has a slideshow that you've created specifically for that interview, right? Like, but at least you can control the images and the progression and the story that you're trying to tell about who you are as an artist or a person. And it's not as willy-nilly as just saying, let's pull up my website.
What gets complicated with a website is the longer you work and the more experience you have to be able to talk about every single thing that they click on.
Right.
no matter how old it
Well, and
is.
it's bigger and more unruly, and you don't really need all those things. I mean, it's nice to have them in existence to show off the full breadth of your work, right? But in an interview, you aren't going to have time to cover everything. And so you want to make sure to hit the things that you are most proud of or you want to really talk about. So having something really focused to what you want to talk about for that specific interview or for that specific point in your career is really important, which is why I tend to advocate for physical. And again, I'm not saying physical has to be paper. It could be a slideshow created on an iPad that you can hand someone or you can look at together, but at least it's catered and created specifically for that situation.
So there's goods and bads to both.
Yeah, and organization-wise, they're very similarly organized.
The other thing that we keep talking about, but not very much, is with organizing and having all of your information in all the shows and list and all that stuff. There are these things that are CVs. I mean, most professionals will end up making a CV, which is the complete list of everything that you've done. But we're not specifically covering that in this one. But they do exist.
I mean, we could talk briefly about it, but so CVs tend to be more important in the education realm because you're talking about things that might be in CVs that would not be on a resume, right? Would be like all the committees you've been on and the hirings and all of the panel discussions you've worked on. I mean, these are also important things to know. So having CV stands for curriculum vitae, so old school academic Latin term. But that's essentially that document I mentioned earlier about like make that list. And so that list can include like, I spoke on a panel at USITT, I was in charge of X at SETC, or it's all the stuff that may not fit on a resume, and it's the master list of all the shows and everything you've ever done. It's a great place to organize the history of you as an artist. It's not like as you get further along in your career, CVs become more important and helpful. So starting one when you're younger and earlier is really helpful because then you don't have to piece together your past like an excavation site, which takes a lot of effort. Speaking from experience.
I'm only 4 years at this point away from graduating college, and finding all of that was even hard now.
Theater life is fast, right? Like you're doing shows back to back, and it's after a while it blurs together, and you really are not going to remember those things. And if you do not write it down as you're doing it, it will be gone. So be cognizant of that as you work forward. Let's look at some portfolios.
Yeah.
Well, my portfolio, and I do have one other digital one too I can show, and some websites. So this is mine. So the first one will be from when I was, you can buy the ones that are like this, that are the what you might think of as more a traditional portfolio. This one is not that huge. Some of them are really huge. I kept this as a nice medium size. And so you see, I included my resume in it. So that covers a lot of that organizational information you might want or need on hand for an occasion in an interview. And you can see over here, actually, this is where at the time I was keeping, this is my literally handwritten master list of every show I had done. And I just had kept it here inside my portfolio. This is before I'd really written up a CV, right? Because at that time I didn't really need it. So that's fine, write it up, just a handwritten thing. That can be all it is, but write it down. So in here, I'm actually including actual sketches of things. This is process, right? Because this is early career. I've only really designed a show or two. So I'm showing everything, right? I want to make sure to cover everything. And so I'm including like the show, who wrote the show, where it was produced, the director, and that kind of information along with it. So I'm showing a model and some research images and the final show shots. Sorry about the bad glares. These are shiny things. And this is also really old, so things are just starting to get crooked and falling apart. I promise it was nice and neat when I made it. And here again, I'm showing some sketches and some stuff. Yeah, so all of that organizational information is on here. And in this case, because this was back in literally the 90s, I'm physically cutting these out of paper and attaching them in there. Here are a bunch of other sketches that I did project-wise as part of a class. So this is the more recent one that I did for after graduate school for applying. Well, I think I used this for my job here. I've got some more branding stuff going on. These were my title blocks for each page. And here I have show shots, but I've also got this more decorative thing. I will tell you, like, I wanted to do something more interesting just because as a designer, a lot of show shots are just black on black on black. And so when you put it in a portfolio, sometimes it's not very fun to look at. So I jazzed it up some, and I will tell you, I got people who really loved it and people who hated it. So this is one of those quirky things I was talking about before, right? I was making a very conscious choice about it, but in some cases it worked in my favor, in other cases it didn't. So, you know, they were unique to each show, and I was branding everything to look similar, had all that organizational information about each show. Here I'm doing some model shots, right? Like I'm doing more than one for each. All right, so I do have some websites and things we can do too.
Making sure when you're doing portfolios and resumes, you want to make sure that you put it on quality paper.
Yes.
So your photo should be on photo paper, and your resume should be printed on paper that you'd be proud to hand to somebody. It shouldn't just be normal weight paper. There is resume paper that you can use, or a nice weight cardstock or something.
Designers can get kind of extra about it. I have a bunch that I've gathered over the years from designers. Like some are printed on like vellum, and some are printed on like super shiny glossy paper. So I think there's a fine line between really nice and looking professional and being a little extra about it. So,
but it's a conscious choice. It needs to be a conscious choice.
Make sure you're making a choice about it. And again, that can fall, like, the more extreme you're thinking about your paper, the more that's going to feel like a quirky choice, and you want to make sure you can support that in some way with your personality, etc. But yeah, it is a choice you're making. So this is a more on what I would call sort of like a slideshow version of a portfolio. So instead of a paper one, this is a PDF one that you can have on like an iPad to have in person. This is from Charles Murdoch Lucas. He spoke in our Strictly Speaking series this semester. Super professional looking, even for just a PDF slideshow. All that information about each show and all the various people. And in this case, because it happened in China, I believe, or no, Korea, excuse me. He's got information in Korean. And he's also telling us what this is, right? This is a production photo. And some of them will be like, this is very thorough, by the way. There's a lot of stuff. If I were taking this to an actual interview, I would not include this amount of stuff. It's probably too much. But there are instances where like, oh, this is a set dressing detail. I know he's got some of them models and 3D models in here as well. It's too much. If to take to an interview, to have on hand for yourself, great. 3D model storyboards, right? So you're some fun stuff. And an organization and a structure to it where it all feels like it's the same and is really nice and professional. So we also have websites. Websites are great. You can find them and do them for free. A lot of times, this one and many of the ones that we're going to look at happen to be Squarespace, and I can tell from the layouts. This is a Squarespace one, pretty sure. Looks very nice. His logoing and branding is all the same, right? I really love how he's laid everything out. I personally think that this is maybe too many categories to have in a menu, but you know, he's a bigger designer. He's worked lots of places, and so the variety in that information can be really helpful. So here we're in scene design. We could go to models, and it would be a bunch of models. You know, and they have the resume here, and you can have an about page, which just sort of have your bio, I would assume. Yep. And you can put all that information that you couldn't fit into your resume. In this case, you know, reviews and press. I don't include full reviews, but I do have quotes in my website, which is this one here. This is also Squarespace. So if I click on this one, for instance, I have all of that organizational information here, but then I also have some quotes from reviews mixed in for that show specifically versus a separate category for it. And again, I can put this is fairly chronologically, but I tend to put the things that I really like or the photos that turned out really great closer to the top of this list. Just to show it off best, because people are going to lose interest partway through. That happens with paper portfolios too, and in-person portfolios. People will probably not make it all the way through your portfolio. So just be aware of that. So you could think about that in terms of the storytelling of it by putting some of your least favorite things near the end. If you think people are not going to make it all the way through. Here's one for a performer. So she has some stuff about her as about her writing in the sections and columns for the various projects she's worked on as a writer. I'm pretty sure this is also Squarespace.
It looks like it, yeah. Squarespace is easy and good to use. It's not free, but
right.
It is. There are both options, free and
paid. Well, Wix.com is good and it has a free portion, and it'll just say at the bottom of it, this is a Wix website. And Wix will work great for early career stuff because it has limitations on the amount of photos and things, but for early career folks, that's less of a problem because they have less stuff. In this case, she's just like, go see my IMDb page, and here's my IMDb link and my representation, and a director. Then she talks about the project she's directed and some trailer for the film that she directed and stuff like that. So this is going to be a very different kind of website than like a designer or technician website. This is the sound designer's website. Really wonderful and different. Got their full bio. And then there are designs, right? So here she's Curious Incident, and there's like sound clips and maybe some promotional stuff for the show. And then of course, all of that organizationing. And here she's got actual like links to other places.
Steppenwolf.
To like Steppenwolf, where, hey, I've worked at Steppenwolf. Hey, I've worked with this person, go to their website. That's great networking and marketing for you and your friends and colleagues as well. That's brilliant. I don't know why I haven't done that yet. I will need to go do that.
It definitely shows that like looking at other people's websites to get ideas on your own is definitely a great idea.
Totally.
Use other people's ideas in what you like to be able to come up with better ideas on your own.
This is scenographer Robbie Smith-Mullins. He does scenery, lighting, and costumes. So having all these different categories is great. I think this might be a Wix site. It looks kind of like how they've done things in the past. But yeah, organization. And then you can have paperwork and diagrams for sound layouts. And I like there's lots of, it doesn't all have to be about pictures. Having a picture to go with some of your diagrams and things to jazz it up could be nice. So those are some examples of that. But yeah, as young designers, process shots of things are handy, especially if you have things that are specific to a show that you worked on. Sort of how I showed you in my old portfolio, like showing some of that process, whether it's about design or construction or costume construction or even paperwork and the evolution of that paperwork, like my resumes earlier, that can be handy, especially for early career folks. I think the last thing I'll talk about is one-sheets, which doesn't come up too often these days. This is maybe more of an old school thing, a little pre-websites, like pre-iPads. One-sheets are sort of like mini portfolios. You might hand them out places. For instance, I participated in like Showcase West in LA and USITT Young Designers Forum when I was out of graduate school. And there are places like Ming Cho Lee's Clam Bake and or SETC, places where you might be running into people and you might hand out resumes, but you can hand out a resume that has portfolio imagery and images and things on the back or the other side. So it's like resume and portfolio together sort of thing. And it's made to be just handing out like crazy. So ideally, it's not two pieces of paper put together with a stapler or a paper clip. Ideally, it's all on one sheet. So you might be compromising in the paper quality for your photos to do that, but they do make some pretty great paper these days that can be really great on the front for your photos and then still work for your resume on the back. So you still want quality, but you might be sacrificing some for your photography, but that depends. And for the photos, you're sort of balancing the size of the imagery with the number of images, right? It's like, this is the best of your shots. I have 5 photos. These are the best 5 photos of everything that you've ever done. This tends to be much more for designers and technicians, but
Something for more like stage managers is when that I've come to find out is when you take your resume and your portfolio stuff to people, stage managers a lot of the time what they want is your paperwork. So they want a call book or something that represents your process through a show more than the shows itself. That is specifically more for stage managers and paperwork oriented positions.
I've done it as a designer too, early in career, like, because again, no iPads back in the day. I had a whole extra binder that was full of drafting, and it wasn't part of my portfolio that you looked through, but it was like, okay, here's the binder with some drafting examples as a separate piece. So yes to all of that.
Yeah, because when at SCTC specifically, when going to the job fair, they just look for people with binders of call sheets, of call books. They kind of half expect it now,
right?
Because it shows your whole process. It shows how you work as a technician.
Yeah.
In how you organize your shows.
So things like one sheets are not things that you would necessarily upload or send to apply for a job. You would just send your resume, and then if you have a website, include the website link. Websites are great for that, right? That's the perfect place for a website. It's to put on your paperwork that you send to a job so that if they want to look it up, they can. But also you could use one sheets for blind mailings, right? Like if you're early career designer or early career technician, or, you know, it's in the same way an actor might send their resume and headshots just to random places. This is the same version of that for designers and technicians. And I do have a couple examples of one sheets as well. So here's a few examples. So this is the one that I had that went with my portfolio before, right? The branding is all the same and I'm using the same fonts. So these are like my favorite photos, period. Resume on the back. This is another person. This goes along with one of the resumes we looked at earlier. It's pretty well organized. I like it okay. But I happen to know that this was paper clipped because of the photo. It was photo paper. That had a weird back. So I would not suggest doing that. Also, it was like 2 sheets of this and a resume. So I would not do that either. Also, this image here is like a rendering for this show. I feel like they should be near each other for you to make that connection.
Also, be careful of paper clipping because when you're shoving them on a pile, they will get lost.
Yeah. Or
other things will get stuck with it.
I get the impulse to not want to put staples through things because it feels sort of like diminishing it in some way. But that's why a one sheet with just front and back is really like, you don't need any of that. This one's sort of like that Rebecca, like this, her font does not match her resume. We looked at her resume. Her resume felt a little unorganized, and this feels a little chaotic to me too, to know what I'm looking at. And there's no labeling information. That's true in here too. There's room here to be labeling some of the, oh, he's got it on the photos. But here there's room for labels. And this was like a half sheet. I thought much too small to be able to really see it. But I liked the resume. Sadly, I remember to scan it to show you. This was one of the ones on vellum, I will say. But very nice. Some decent examples. But yeah, you can also come back next semester and bring us your resume or portfolio if you want us to look at it, and we'll give some feedback. I guess with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks everybody for coming. We hope it was helpful. Sorry, it's overwhelming. It's a lot. That's what might be good for the next semester one, is we'll be able to like really look at a few and be more specific.
This should go up on YouTube. So if you want to look back and rewatch some of it slowly.
Right. If you miss something, you can always go back through it. All right. Thanks everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thanks.